This video is going to focus on prototyping and some of the flexibility that has, and some of these key things to think about. So, just as a place to start, I'll define prototyping. We'll talk about a couple different ways. I'm going to try and do this really fast. But one of the reasons, just like with any writing process, design process, decision process, we take time in the beginning because it costs us less money, energy, or time to do it in an early design phase than to fix something that or to resolve, to make an adjustment, a stronger correction, or to resolve a full-on failure. It's harder to come back from. So we'd rather plan ahead to move forward, to prevent errors. So we want a healthy design process, and one major part of that is prototyping. So as we think about the design process, we can dig into this idea for prototyping. Actually, here it is. So just to be clear, and I am borrowing this from the Interaction Design Foundation, hooray, site sources, if it weren't obvious from the page. But we're going to be, when we think about prototyping, it's an experimental process where design teams implement ideas into tangible forms from paper to digital, if your goal is digital. If your goal is a board game, the idea is to create a micro version or a simplified, scaled down version. Teams can build prototypes of varying degrees of fidelity to capture design concepts, test users, and so part of the prototyping process is do a quick, easy version, a simplified version, a pared down version of whatever you're trying. And what you're looking for is you want it to be fully functional. You want it to function. You want it to be able to perform the function that you're trying to test, or be able to perform the interaction that you're trying to test, whatever it is. So you want to make sure that when you build a prototype, it's the, some people look at it as, I think it's the simplest form of the product, or the simplest form of the interaction, like the least you can do energy and effort and resource wise to get a proof of concept, or to check for errors or problems in the design and that sort of thing. What is the smallest, simplest form of this to test this one piece of whatever I'm trying to do? So that is core. So as part of that, forgive me for jumping here. So when it comes to prototyping, there are low fidelity, high fidelity, whatever it is. In my classes, I've already talked about the ideation stage and brainstorming. So the step from brainstorming and ideation to prototyping is, and it's not a, we know it's not a linear process if we pay attention to anything with the design process, forgive me. But we know that design thinking it's a non-linear process. Just like the writing process, we're moving in and out of each step. Sometimes we have to go back and re-empathize, redefine, re-ideate, and all of that fun stuff. But for prototyping, the ideation sparks an idea. We want to see that idea. So part of prototyping, we build. So it is a building process. But we do have to make choices and get started and lean into this idea of developing a prototype. So when we are prototyping, sometimes we just have to start building. Just like with storyboarding in the ideation phase, or doing a rough sketch, or doing concept art, all of these things are meant to see if the ideas that we have are going to work for whatever problem we're trying to solve for our user or our audience, and that sort of thing. So we want to start building. We don't want to spend too much time in our head. We want to produce. So part of that is make sure that you're being governed by a core problem statement. You should have already developed that. Make sure that you have a clear purpose. That's really what it comes down to. You can't prototype without purpose, because then you're just kind of playing with cardboard, or playing with paper, or playing in a sandbox program, or whatever it is. So we want to make sure that we are leaning into the action-oriented development. We should have brainstormed, we should have ideated by now as a starting place. So now we want to try and build something, see if it works. Whether that's, a dice tower that functions a certain way, whether it's like mousetrap, we want to see if one particular part of the mousetrap works. We want to see if we can build our own spinner so that it lands a certain way, to see if that's balanced and test it out, and whatever it is. If we're going to hand build our own dice. Those are all things. So don't spend too much time on it. The whole point is we want to get to where a user can try and use this thing that we're creating. And so sometimes that may mean if you're developing an online game in a sandbox kind of environment like RPG Playground, that might mean that you, instead of building a level that in your head has 12 characters and 15 side quests, first you just choose one or two to see if your players can guide themselves through the two NPCs that you have for them to interact with, or whatever it is. There's a lot of different ways you could do this. And my students should have engaged in some of this reading, and so I'm just scanning some core parts of it. But just remember, the purpose of prototyping is to save us time, energy, or money in the long run by having a good process. It's kind of like, since Valentine's Day is today when I'm making this video, it's kind of like the person who says, my purpose is to have a really good Valentine's Day date. And then they don't do anything and then show up at a really nice restaurant with no reservations, still expecting to have a really nice date. Probably not going to happen. But if you plan, a week, even a day in some places out, but some time out depending on the particular restaurant, get reservations at the time that it makes sense to prevent that cost or that correction or that failure. Because, to quote Jimmy Fallon, no one wants to end up at Applebee's because you didn't make a reservation. Unless Applebee's is nice for you. Maybe that's better than McDonald's. Who knows? But we do have, prototyping. We have low fidelity, high fidelity. For low fidelity, these are usually more paper products. They're fast, cheap, disposable, easy to make changes to, test new iterations. However, they're not as realistic depending on what you're trying to create. And so sometimes it's oversimplified, can oversimplify complex issues, and can make the stage of prototyping less effective, but they're quick. There's also high fidelity. These, if you're dealing with a digital product, maybe part of what you're trying to test is the digital prototyping. Does this software work like it needs to? Can I engage and move around in it? So it really depends on what part of the thing you're designing you're trying to emphasize. However, it can take longer, and it does cost more or need more specialty skills, or there's a bit more of a learning curve to deal with some of the technology, whereas most people have been cutting up paper and building things with their hands in cardboard form for something since like elementary school, even if they're out of practice or they're not very crafty. So part of it is don't focus so much on the core, don't focus so much on how pretty it looks. When you're prototyping, you are looking at its essential function. You're simplifying and you're drilling down in. Now, one big part of this whole process is as you prototype, maybe the thing you're struggling with is it usable? Is it functional? But part of that also means, especially with game design, which is what my class is working on, especially with game design, is it performing that core purpose of fun, right? What makes this different than a study habit, right? Then, if there are cards involved, where's the fun? So sometimes to create fun, when prototyping, part of it is trying to see if different parts of, applying story or making associative links works. If someone's doing if someone's looking at the Myers-Briggs test and they're trying to draw something from psychology and create games with it, well, it might be hard to create a game that's based on 16 different personality types. But what if instead of 16 different personality types, you went associative and you said, okay, most games are 2 to 4 players. So what if we made each of the, I and E or S and T or, sensing, thinking or feeling and perceiving or whatever it is. I know I've got those mixed up. But what if instead of 16, we have 4 and they're not just 4 concepts, they're 4 families. And so then, instead of a sorry board, you've got 4 families and they take on the character traits of, introverted, extroverted, or sensing or perceiving or thinking or feeling or judging, or you get it. So whatever that is. So you want to think associatively and don't feel like, especially if you're trying to create an educational game, part of prototyping is building these things and but also part of it's testing to see if the fun still happens. And so if an educational game is providing too much information and not enough fun, can you find a way to balance that out? Can you be associative? Can you tie it to story? Can you tie to common character tropes? It is okay to think in an oversimplified way for a game. That is one part of this. And then let the underlying way that the game is built be what presents some sort of educational content. So those are some things to keep in mind as you go through this prototyping process. So even if you're going to do something digital, you may still be able to do some basic layout prototyping like this. You could do storyboarding, and there are a bunch of different resources online that you can find, like the GDQ YouTube site and all of that has tons of resources. But remember to stay focused on your purpose. Make it quick and easy, but it should still be functional. And part of that function is what are the purposes that I'm trying to come up with? Because if my purpose is to have fun, at some point I have to create a prototype to see if it's actually fun. So prototypes have to be functional, even if they're oversimplified. And if you are still trying to see if it functions to create fun, then you can't necessarily worry about style yet. But if you're at the stage where that matters, make sure and that could be a whole other stage or iteration of prototyping, testing, design, and that whole thing. So that's the bare bones minimum on prototyping. The next thing will be testing, but we're not there yet. So prototyping, you can do high fidelity, low fidelity. Start with a purpose, because that's what guides what you're testing, what you're creating, what you're trying to test the function of. And don't be afraid to continue to go back and forth between prototyping and ideating and testing, depending on which functions are continuing to work. And hang on to that concept about, if you're trying to design something and it's supposed to be fun or interesting or engaging, that is a whole other piece of the purpose that does need testing. And you can play with that by being associative, tying it to character, tying it to pop culture, or some of the octalysis like 8 human motivations stuff. Have a good day and enjoy building your prototypes.